Welcome to the Summercast, a podcast aimed at making fundamentalism great again by applying confessional Baptist doctrine to all of life.
It has always been my intention to be very careful about how I interact with different positions other than my own. And so I have had the philosophy in the past and at present that the primary source material ought to really be the springboard of the conversation, if you will. And there is a reheating of the debate between presuppositionalism and classicalism. And every time I have interacted with this issue, I have tried to bring the primary source material from men like Cornelius Van Til and Greg Bahnsen to bear on the discussion, whether that be in my articles, whether that be in any sort of interaction online. Now, I'm not claiming to be perfect at this. I have failed at this several times over, more times than I could count. Yet, I want my listeners to know what my heart is behind the conversation. Because as of late, any time I have posted on this, articles that do indeed interact with the primary source material, I am either called names, I'm laughed at with the little laugh button, and that's fine. That's fine. But if we want this to be a Christian conversation in which we use our brains to figure out what the truth is, we need to move beyond those kinds of antics. And so I don't think that this should be a debate had primarily on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever. The robustness of this conversation is just too much for that. It's too heavy for that. And so I would like to see it move out more into a video format and even public in-person formats because I do think it's a debate worth having. I think it's, this latest eruption of conversation. I mean, I don't know how many times, what number this one is. How many times has this volcano erupted? I don't know. It's done it so many times that I've lost track. I mean, it just seems like that we keep coming back to the conversation. It'll fizzle out for a season and maybe even be silent for like a whole year, but it'll eventually boil back up to the surface, and you'll have two groups that'll really sharply distinguish themselves one from the other, and they'll just go to slashing throats, right? And part of that has been driven by the recent scholarship of men like James Dolezal, Richard Muller, and some others, which is good. It's positive scholarship. The problem here is that the debate between apologetic methodologies has not been connected really to the metaphysics, if you will, of classical Christian theism, which is really what the classical method dovetails with, or you might even say it rises out of that in terms of how we go about defending our faith, or defending the existence of God and such. And so, what I wanted to do is come on here and really call both sides of the discussion to an intellectual rigor and a robustness of argumentation that I do not think has been seen for a while. The last time this has been really addressed in any significant manner has probably been when Sproul and Gerstner and Lindsley released their book on classical apologetics. there was then some interaction between men like Sproul and Bonson, right? But even that was really just kind of scratching at the surface. There really has not been, from what I understand, there really has not been a meaningful conversation between the Van Tillians and the classical Christian theists, where the classical Christian theists bring the historical source material to bear on the discussion. The framers of the Reformed confessions, right? The post-Reformed scholastics like Peter Van Maastricht, Stephen Charnock, John Owen, even. This conversation, the conversation on apologetics, I think really needs to be moved back further to a conversation on metaphysics and epistemology. I appreciate the Van Tillians for wanting to discuss the epistemological angle, right? And I think we should both sides should be willing to engage in that discussion. What I don't so much like is the conflation that laymen often make between epistemology on the one side and apologetic methodology on the other. So it's just assumed that something like the transcendental argument for the existence of God arises out of Van Til's epistemology. And so Van Til's epistemology and Christian apologetics have been basically made into synonyms. And I don't think that has been a wise move, because there have been Christians that have been using the transcendental argument before Van Til was even around, or before presuppositionalism was even a thought, and they were not grounding it in something like Van Til's epistemology. So that hasn't been too helpful. Another thing that hasn't really been helpful is the language of autonomy, which I tried to address in my second to last article. I think it was my second to last article. Where it's assumed that if you don't use the transcendental argument, and if you don't presuppose revelational epistemology, you therefore think man is autonomous, or at least you assume the autonomy of man's reasoning. That is just not true. If you're looking for straw men, that is a straw man. The medieval scholastics, for example, wouldn't even dream of thinking of appropriating something like human autonomy in any positive fashion into their philosophy and theology. It just wouldn't be something that would be tenable for them. It wouldn't. In fact, it wasn't even a thought, the idea. Because the metaphysics at that time was generally driving the discussion. It wasn't a discussion on epistemology so much as it was on metaphysics. And because it was a discussion mainly had within the realm or sphere of metaphysics, especially the Christian metaphysicians at the time, Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, others, they wouldn't allow for even the inkling of the possibility of human autonomy in any sense. Thomas, for example, look at his lectures on Romans 9 and Romans 8, and his robust view of the doctrine of election and predestination. Look at the fourfold causality, right? You have the efficient cause, the formal cause, material cause, the final cause. And look at the hierarchical and linear categories under the efficient causal category, subcategories under the efficient causal category. And what you'll see is that it is impossible from a logical standpoint, from the law of non-contradiction and extrapolating from that, from the principle of causality, to rationally assert something like human autonomy. So the medievals and the post-reformed, like the Puritans, did not presuppose autonomy or assume autonomy in their reasoning. largely because the conversation was centering around metaphysics. Now, in the late 17th century, early 18th century, a rise in rationalism can be seen in kind of the historical trajectory. And you can see some of this in men like Jonathan Edwards. I don't think there's anything wrong with Jonathan Edwards at face value. I do think that there were some probably some rationalistic influences in him. J.A. Turretin before him, maybe some, according to Richard Muller. But speed up to halfway through the 18th century, and you are looking at the breaking open of Enlightenment thought, and the Enlightenment way of thinking through the discussion upon the shoulders of epistemology, because Hume's skepticism was largely epistemological. The question was not metaphysical in nature. It was how can we're being presumptuous when we think that we can identify the cause of the effect, because we are assuming that there's this hard and fast, tight connection between cause and effect, when really it's a loose connection, or we should understand it as being a loose connection. For example, how can we know for certain that when it rains and the grass gets wet, that it's the rain making the grass wet and not a bunch of little fairies going around and making the grass wet, right? How do we know that for certain? We can't know that for certain, right? And so therefore, skepticism ensues. And you speed up to Kant, and Kant advances the epistemological conversation with his idealism. And I think in some positive ways, in order to save the phenomena, right? To get away from Hume's skepticism and to kind of save science and even religion to some extent. Presuppositionalism happens on the other side of that. Totally. Before Hume and Kant, you were not finding categories such as worldview. You were not finding an emphasis placed on what we know, right? You were finding an emphasis placed on what is out there, right? What is out there? And the scriptures, for example, if you're a Christian, the scriptures already assume that we can know truth, right? So as a Christian, we shouldn't be asking the question of, how do we know it's true? Well, the whole Christian religion is predicated upon the assumption that we can know what's true. Jesus Christ himself said, I am the truth, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. The scriptures presuppose intelligibility of the world and of truth claims, right? And so why would we even go back to, unless we were being influenced by Hume and Kant, why would we even go back to questioning how we know what we know, or can we even know what we know, and then trying to construct, as it were, a Christian epistemology off of the assumption that we need to give an account for human rationality? Who says we need to give an account for intelligibility? The only people that said we need to do that is Hume and Kant, right? And others in their camp. The only people that said we need to go back and try to justify the preconditions of intelligibility, like the laws of logic, are Enlightenment thinkers. And so the classical guys, like myself, look at Van Til and say, you are granting way too much to the Enlightenment thinkers. We know that Van Til was not a proponent, an outspoken proponent of Enlightenment thought. In fact, he criticized Kant numerous times. But he bows down to their demand when he says, we need to go back and justify the preconditions of human intelligibility. And the way you do that is by the transcendental argument for the existence of God. The way you do that is by dialectical refutation, right? And internal critique, as Bonson would call it. And the problem, of course, is that you have to assume the laws of thought in all of those things. You have to assume the basic reliability of sense perception in all of those things. And so it's giving too much to the Enlightenment community. And as Christians, we shouldn't be saying, well, we need to go back and try to justify our use of the laws of logic and things like that. That is bowing down to a demand that we are not obligated to answer. That is bowing down to a demand that we are not obligated to bow down to as Christians. We do not have to listen to the Enlightenment thinkers. I will say that a large part of Hume and Hume's, especially Hume's skepticism, is illogical. He's trying to get us to be skeptical about everything we know, but yet he wants us to know what he's saying, right? He wants us to know and understand and take seriously what he's saying. And so if that is the kind of irrationality coming out of someone like Hume, why are we taking him seriously as Christians? Why are we taking him seriously? Why did Van Til take him seriously? We don't have to take their category seriously. We don't have to import anything that they said into the schema of Christian theology. We don't have to. And most of my criticisms of Van Til has been that he has tried to synth Christianity with Enlightenment thought, either inadvertently or purposefully. And my contention is that that's not right. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be granting that much to Enlightenment thinkers. And then to go about, exegeting Romans 1 in light of things that Van Til has written, providing or producing ahistorical interpretations of that text that nobody prior to that point would have adopted. Anachronistically, using Calvin Institutes, Book 1, right, on the Sensus Divinitatis, like Oliphant did, in Covenantal Apologetics, and in Reasons for Faith, Philosophy in the Service of Theology. It's just we need to be brutally honest in this conversation. We need to be asking the right questions, but more importantly, we need to be giving the right answers to the questions that are already out there. And I've not seen that happen. And I think both sides are at fault to some extent, but in my experience, I'm not getting any interaction with the primary source material from the presuppositional camp. Maybe I don't have enough presuppositionalist friends, but I am not seeing the rigorous interaction with men like Van Til and Thomas Aquinas that I've seen from classicalists. I have not seen them try to justify their epistemological assumptions in light of something like classical Christian theism, where you're looking at Stephen Charnock, you're looking at John Owen, you're looking at Peter Van Maastricht, even John Calvin, Francis Turretin, most certainly, who were scholastic in their methodology, and we're basically operating with a realist epistemology, not Van Til's epistemology, which is not a realist epistemology at all. So, anyways, I just think what we need to be doing is we need to be willing to put in the legwork to interact with these sources, with sources like that, right? And if you were to come to my house and look through those books, you would see that they're all marked up. They're all marked up because it was the year 2015 when, I think it was, no, actually probably the year 2014 when I really decided to kick it into gear in terms of trying to understand Van Til. And from 2014 to probably about 2016 or 17, 2016, I was convinced that Van Til was it. So for about 3 years, give or take a few months, I was a committed, well-read presuppositional apologist, right? I mean, that was my MO. I was a presuppositionalist. I had it down. I had the revelational epistemology down pat. I practically applied it in a public debate, which you can watch on YouTube, right? And when I realized, I think it was when I read All That Is in God by James Dalzell, and maybe a little bit before that when I started reading more of the Puritans, that I realized that I was outnumbered by the historical consensus in terms of a Reformed understanding of theology. And in fact, I could not find Van Til anywhere. And then I came to realize by a broader reading of Calvin that he was misusing Calvin, or seemed to be misunderstanding at least Calvin in many areas. The sensus divinitatis is one of them. And so I backed away from presuppositionalism, but continued interacting with the primary source material with men like Van Til, in order to inform both my understanding and in order to interact with those whom I came to disagree with, after all. And this is not, yay me, yay Josh, you've done something great. No, it's not at all. It's by the grace of God alone that any of this happens, any of these discussions, any of these conversations. I'm just wanting to say that it's my personal sentiment, and I think it's the biblically responsible thing to do, is to put in the legwork, and yes, it is legwork, it is work, to understand what's going on in men like Van Til and what's going on the classical side of things, like in Aquinas and Turretin and elsewhere. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed this episode, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Click the bell for continued notifications so you can know when new content drops. And also, if you did not like this episode, if you thought it was total garbage, give me a thumbs down, but please let me know why, all right, in the comments section. God bless you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day.